The other thing that I think is often not emphasized is the fact that you get a higher level of care when you go into a clinical trial. I did. I was being seen weekly. Granted, it was a lot on me to, have my mother drive me in every week for, it took 2 hours each way into New York City. But the point that I'm making here is there was a solace that I felt in the fact that I had such robust care.
We were talking about clinical trials in IBD and why you think patients see the clinical trials as really a last resort.
I think patients really see clinical trials as a last resort because here's the thing, especially with IBD, you don't generally tend to think of it as a life-threatening disease, but it can be without medication. It got to that point for me, and it did take my dad's life and my aunt's life in the 90s. And you don't equate it with a condition like cancer. And even in conditions like cancer, these are considered last resorts or you're a guinea pig. I think there needs to be a lot more work destigmatizing clinical trials, perhaps rebranding them, the name clinical trials. I think they've gotten a bad rap, especially from historical mistrust in communities of color. And this is the Black, Hispanic communities, but it's also, the indigenous populations, LGBTQ, and the Asian community and Middle Eastern communities that have been colonized. So I think that, a lot of the issues around clinical trials is that patients often think that it's not for mild to moderate disease. And now that we're coming out with different types of drugs with different targets, different mechanisms of action that can be for more mild to moderate disease, besides some of the traditional options that have existed, like mesalamine, oral drugs, for instance, that have come up, S1Ps that have come up that are for a more moderate disease, I think we need to rebrand how we're looking at clinical trials. And even with biologics, patients often consider them a last resort and for severe disease, but there are biologics for moderate disease too. And I think we really need to reframe how patients are thinking about clinical trials, and that, rather than getting to a more severe level of disease like mine is, I have an ostomy, I've had several fistulae, had a J pouch. It was very hard for me to get into a clinical trial, but no provider actually told me early on in my disease that it would be really important for you to consider this, Tina, because as you get more complex, you may not be able to join a clinical trial so easily. I did join a clinical trial eventually, and it was after all these exclusion criteria. It was because the PI was treating me and got an exception on my case. But most people wouldn't have access to that, wouldn't have knowledge to that extent. And I only developed that knowledge as a result of significant disease experience. And that's not how we need to approach this. We need to approach mild to moderate patients. We need to approach them through doctors, through investigators who are fully trained and can understand why it's important to bring up clinical trials early on, and what the benefits are of doing so.
Yeah. So we'll have to unpack a bit of that because you said quite a lot in that response. So let's go back to the sort of perception piece first, because I think it's really important. And I won't mention names, but someone in our panel specifically said something about getting a placebo, which is not really how clinical trials are run. I think that's a misconception that you will get a placebo or you will get, it's kind of like potluck. Do I get the investigational treatment or do I get a placebo? And it's really normally done as you get the investigative, the medicine being investigated, or you get the standard of care, right? You get the next, get the best treatment available. Myths like this, I think, prevent people from even considering. So do you think that's like step one is kind of educate people about what clinical trials really are Did you have any of those thoughts when you sort of started as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think the placebo is one of the top things that a patient looks at, when considering or not considering a clinical trial, so to speak, and that whole randomization process. Like I've heard from patients who are randomized every 12 weeks and they knew exactly what they were getting because they would fall sick like clockwork.
Mm.
But, they also knew, some of them were educated and informed enough to know that, they're going to eventually get the drug and to stay put because nothing else was working. But, a mild to moderate patient who has more than one option would not even approach it that way. They'd be like, I'm done with this trial. I'm going to go on, I'm going to go on the standard of care. I do think that patients need to be informed that a lot of times you will be getting standard of care, and that, placebo, how it's being utilized, when it might be utilized. They know it's double blinded, that it's blinded on both sides, but at the same time, they need to be educated. And I think this is where a clinical research coordinator really comes in to explain to them, this is how the trial is going to work. This is what we can guarantee. This is what we can't guarantee, in terms of what's going to happen. And, that we can't guarantee outcomes, but these are your rights in the trial. And that the other thing that I think is often not emphasized is the fact that you get a higher level of care when you go into a clinical trial. I did. I was being seen weekly. Granted, it was a lot on me to, have my mother drive me in every week for, took 2 hours each way into New York City. But the point that I'm making here is there was a solace that I felt in the fact that I had such robust care. Normally you're seeing the doctor, every 3 or 4 months, even if you have significant disease. This meant that I was getting a higher level of care, and was being very proactively managed and very closely watched. And I think patients don't realize that. These are some points we absolutely need to educate on and emphasize when it comes to clinical trials.
Yeah. And I have heard some companies, specifically people with early pipeline products, talking about changing the randomization so it's not half and half, because there's not just one IBD trial going on at any one time, right?
Exactly.
There are multiple new, and that's part of the exciting thing, is that there are new treatments coming out. And I mean, I remember my first IBD project hearing people talk about steroids and 5-ASAs, and I think we've moved on a
We've
fair
moved
bit from
on.
those. And it's really exciting that there are new advanced, like you said, new treatments that have different targets and have different mechanisms of action. It's really a good time to be considering a clinical trial.
I
But
think
if you
so.
already have this kind of idea of how things are going to be, like I have a 50-50 chance of getting a placebo, it's going to immediately put people off, and especially people like you mentioned in more maybe socioeconomically challenged
Yeah.
groups or different ethnic groups.
Yeah.
I mean, you will know this as well.
Yeah.
Being running the South Asian
Yeah.
IBD community,
Yeah.
you will know that there are cultural perceptions that also,
There,
it's very
there really
nuanced,
are.
right? Yeah.
There really are. And I think that's the other thing that needs to be done is like a heavy focus on education in some of these communities of color and LGBTQ communities. And also the other thing that I want to emphasize here is that a lot of clinical trial recruitment is happening, as far as I understand, and I could be wrong, out of Eastern Europe and, out of the West. There's like developing economies that are now developing IBD, including South Asia, including the Middle East, including East Asia, and even South America. You look at Brazil and Chile, Argentina, that are heavily now developing IBD, arguably, higher rates than in the West. A recent study that Saya, my organization, did, and it's going to be published very soon in The Lancet, it's been accepted, is that the epidemiology of South Asian IBD in South Asia is looking now the same as the West. Yeah. This is a ticking time bomb. They don't have drug options there, not to the extent that we do. It's highly, highly important for pharma and CROs to bring these trials now to the developing world. get that diversity in their recruitment, understand what mechanisms of action and targets are being responded to by different ethnic groups, and also provide them with access to care that they wouldn't have otherwise had. It's a win-win for everyone. And that is something that I am heavily advocating for, is that we need to bring these trials now to other countries.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, and even diverse populations within Western countries, because
Exactly.
it's not
Exactly.
homogeneous in any market, right?
Oh no. And 100%, and not just developing economies, but even in the West, in the diaspora, looking at US, Canada, Europe, and also Australia, New Zealand, looking at these communities, because even, I can speak for my community, but you look at some of the studies that are going on, and South Asians have some of the highest rates of IBD out of Canada, out of Malaysia, out of New Zealand, out of the US as well, according to a 2015 study. So, I just want to put that also out there, is that we need to be reaching these populations because they are developing IBD at unprecedented rates compared to before.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, these are great points. And I think, so obviously there's the communication work that the pharmaceutical industry needs to do. There's also the diversity, not just in select markets where there's high commercial opportunities, but also in like you said, in these developing economies as well. What else is it that industry you think needs to do? I mean, positioning, I know, definitely positioning the trials.
Yeah.
But that's part of the comms approach, I think.
Yeah. So, I've been a patient advocate now for almost 7 years, and advising on clinical trials for the last 5 to 6 years. And what do I mean by that? I mean, looking at endpoints, looking at the protocol, and if this is patient friendly, what could be done to make it more patient friendly. And there's been highs and lows. There's been sometimes when pharma will bring us in as patient advocates, very informed patient advocates. We get brought in sometimes too late, and those endpoints have already been decided. There's a few I can think of right off the top of my head, and I'm like, of course this trial's failing, and then those trials have been shelved. And it's so heartbreaking as a patient advocate to see that, when I would have designed the trial differently. I think there's some of us in the community who are highly experienced, have scientific backgrounds, or advanced degrees, who can really help with the design of the trials, their endpoints, how to make them patient friendly, how to make them attractive to patients. Two, looking at when does this cross over? When does the open label period open? What would be appealing to a patient in terms of how long that placebo goes on? Can we shorten the washout periods? Is this something we can get approved through the FDA? These are all things that they need to consult patients on. Some companies are doing it, some are not. And I think that would change the game in a lot of ways. Just having even 5 or 6 of us opine on this, maybe bringing in a few lay patients, 3 or 4 lay patients, separately or together with us, to look at the same thing. To the average patient, what is this looking like? Bring in the more informed patients, like I was saying, and have them design this. I think there's ways to go about this that are creative, that involve patients, that empower patients too, and that they can also say, this was something that was helped designed by a few, very experienced and informed patients. I think it needs to be done across the board.
I agree with you. Also, the actual clinical trial experience. So you mentioned earlier that it was quite burdensome for you to sort of travel 2 hours, there and back, even though you had a higher standard of care. So I wonder if also that's something that the industry needs to look at, is like how, because completely, like 100% virtual trials also have their own challenges, right?
Of course.
And I mean, obviously, if you're in the U.S. and you can have a nurse specialist come to your house and do bloods and all of that, that's great. But like once you move outside of the U.S. and that system, that sort of breaks down a bit.
Yeah.
But I wonder if what are your thoughts on sort of optimizing that sort of patient experience as well?
Absolutely. So I think decentralized trials are a great thing. I think, especially with the pandemic, they've definitely gained a lot of traction, and they are more attractive to patients. And I do wish that I could have had that approach, especially like if I could talk to the investigator who happened to be my doctor, one-on-one, even if it's over telehealth, and if a nurse practitioner or nurse or someone came out to, deliver the drug or take my labs or whatever, game changer. But you're right, that might work in the United States, but it could fall apart in some international circumstances. I do think still having that option at a local hospital, or a local hospital clinical trial site in major locations of different countries. So if we're looking at London, or if we're looking at Mumbai or New Delhi, I know patients would have to travel, but I know patients who really do want to get well and who do want to have access to these medications, who would be motivated to try, especially if we're doing that education. I think that once we build out these frameworks in different countries, the solutions will start to open up in terms of how to decentralize and how to approach this based on different economies and different regulations, et cetera. But if we don't try to open those up and don't work with patient advocates and patient advocacy groups to do that education, it's just never going to happen. That's what I think. I think number one, of course, what I said is help get patients to help you design the trials and the protocols. And then number two is work with their nonprofit organizations, if they have them, to disseminate information, even co-create clinical trial education, maybe pool a few patient advocacy groups together to do that education, and globally, really, and then work with some of those groups to launch those trials in different countries too, including the US and Canada and the West, and work with certain sites. Like, for instance, on SIA, we have board members, medical advisory panel. Some of them are interested in being investigators or have been in the past. We can certainly refer some names, put that together, and help with the launch of those trials. I think it's really important to engage the community and some of the grassroots organizations in this, as well as some of the larger organizations across the globe, in terms of building the profile of clinical trials and getting the word out and demystifying them and doing the education.
Yeah, I think patient communities are vital for all of this. And one of the things that has really been sort of, I don't know, it's always bothered me, is that, the clinical trial, like once the clinical trial data is out, the pharmaceutical industry tends to engage with physicians very heavily. They'll have MSLs who will be in contact with the doctors to say, here's the data and here's what it means for your practice, or contextualizing it for doctors. But none of that ever happens for patients. And so thus there's a big gaping hole between the science and the data and patient understanding of what's coming down the pipeline. And it seems like that the patient advocacy groups or communities could sort of bridge that gap a bit,
Right.
But they need a bit of support from the industry. Like it'd be lovely if we had patient science liaisons. It's a made up role that I dream about.
I love that.
Actually having it. But MSL's part of their role is to bring the patient voice to sort of bridge the gap between doctors and pharmaceutical industry. But they're not really, like, doctors don't really represent the voice of the patient. So I almost feel like that's the missing piece, is like having the MSLs work with advocacy groups and with patient experts like yourself, I think would just be a game changer in the clinical trial space. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that, I have been doing, is meeting with MSLs from different sponsors for SIA, just to understand what's going on in our community and share some of the patient experiences, but also to build some of those relationships so that they understand why they need to support us and how we can work together to bridge some of those gaps. So one of the things our organization is looking to work on in 2025 is moving towards that clinical trial space a little bit more heavily. And one of the things that we want to do is to identify in both the South Asian and Middle Eastern communities, because that's the other thing, we're attracting Middle Eastern and East Asian patients as well as a grassroots organization, and we are evaluating what that means. But sort of bring to the limelight what are the cultural barriers. Because if pharma understands what the cultural barriers are, they can start developing interventions with us for how to approach this and how to approach it differently. So that's one of my goals for 2025 and beyond, is to sort of work together with our sponsors to really understand what the unmet needs are and what the cultural barriers are in our communities. Asia is 60% of the world's population. And South Asians alone are 25% of the world's diaspora. I'm just going to put that out there. And if we're not looking at some of these communities, we're missing the mark.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And I do think that the work that you're doing can help to sort of bring the MSLs closer to the patients, because I really feel like just going back from doctor to pharma, it doesn't really bring the patient voice that much closer, does it? And it really feels like to me, that feels like the missing piece in all of this is
it is.
Yeah.
It is. And there are very qualified patient advocates, as you've seen, who can really help with a lot of this and who can help advise on a lot of this. It's just, they need to tap us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just speaking to an MSL about the latest data that's come out of a trial, you could help contextualize that. Okay, this is what it means for patients. You've told me what the data is and what it means for the healthcare physicians. Right now, I can translate that to sort of patient language, and then help create materials that the patient advocacy groups could then put out there. So it just would increase understanding of what's coming, and also I think just raise the bar in terms of people's understanding of the importance of clinical trials.
I completely agree. And I do want to share another thing is, I know that there's larger organizations in the space, but there's also there's an unmet need that's clearly happening, and why smaller organizations are forming. Some people, because this is a highly stigmatized disease, the LGBTQ population may be flocking towards one organization. The South Asian population might be flocking towards another. Black Hispanic might be flocking towards another. And there's a reason why, because they feel more comfortable based on, the community that they're getting. So we run this private Facebook community of 1,650 patients and caregivers across the East and the West. We do education in there. They ask for support. We end up educating them on how to navigate their care. What I'm saying here is, a lot of these groups have communities that are not traditionally being reached. And I think that's why it's going to be very important for pharma to continue to support and tap into the resources we have, but also help us build capacity to build more resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been amazing, and I knew it would be. I had no doubts. And it really, I think we've only just scratched the surface, to be honest with you.